Morning, everybody. Let's see.
Good morning.
Morning, Rabbi.
Okay, so we had just continuing our discussion of making sure that you don't hurt someone's feelings, and we learned yesterday the story of Mar Zutra and his wife, who ran away from the poor person so that he shouldn't feel embarrassed when they. And of course, what was the issue? He himself, the poor person, was himself curious. Like, I want to see who these people are so I can thank them. But because Mar Zutra was a prominent Rav in the community, and he would probably run into this fellow on a regular basis, Mar Zutra felt that on a long-term basis, this fellow would be embarrassed over the course of time. And I have to say that for an additional reason, Mar Zutra was very wise, because quite often, when you do a kind act for someone and you're in regular contact with them, not only can that cause embarrassment, but it can also cause enmity. That's right, that, over time, the recipient of the chesed can actually sometimes come to resent the person who does the chesed for him. And perhaps Mar Zutra felt that in order to avoid that enmity that might be generated over the course of time, it would be better for he and his wife to never be identified by the man. And the Gemara had made a point of saying that we learn from the story or that Mar Zutra and his wife learned from the story of Tamar, that it is better to throw yourself in a furnace than to publicly embarrass someone. And that word publicly is now the issue of a discussion in the Biurim, because the word rabim in public is subject to a vague interpretation. What does it mean you can't embarrass someone publicly? And if you do, you lose your portion in the world to come. So does that mean in front of a group of people? Does it mean in front of other people? How many people? And so that's what I just wanted to clarify in this biurim that we're going to see now. Penei chavero berabim. So he writes in the biurim, v'yesh lehistapek mahu geder rabim bazeh. The question is, what is the number? In other words, at what point do I have to go to great effort to avoid embarrassing someone publicly? What is public? V'im gam ze nichlal b'mesha amru v'kama rabim. Rav Nachman Omar Gimel, Reb Yitzchak Omar Asara. There's a Gemara that in Gittin that asks the question, how much is public? And Rav Nachman says it's 3, Reb Yitzchak says it's 10. And you know that 3 and 10 are numbers that we call public depending upon the context. For a minyan, which is tefillah b'tzibor, you have 10. For a zimun, you have 3, right? So yadu v'ayin sham b'tos v'shekasuv da'aldas rabim lo boy eloshnayim. And Tosfos writes that sometimes, in order to do something based on public consent, sometimes you only need a consensus of 2 people. V'yesh la'ayin k'tzas me'etzem hamakor shehevi kan harab shehu b'ksuva samach zayin amid beis. And what really needs analysis is the story itself that we learned yesterday about Mar Ukva and his wife, right? That Mar Ukva hava anya v'chulei v'sham lo haya ela Mar Ukva v'ishto. And there, the only 2 people that were aware that would potentially embarrass this person were Mar Ukva and his wife. They were the only 2 people present in that scenario that we know of, at least, right? That we have no indication that there was anyone else in that story other than the poor man, Mar Ukva, and Mrs. Mar Ukva. Ve'alzeh amru sham umay kulei hai. And the Gemara asks the question, why did they go to such great extents to hide their identities from the poor man? Upirish Rashi, and as Rashi explains over there, Lama lahem livrach v'likanis batanur. Why did they feel it necessary to run and hide in a furnace? Umishani da'amar marzutra noch la adam sheimsar atzmu letoch kivshan ha'esh va'al yalbin pnei chaver berabim adkan. And the Gemara answers that Marzutra himself had said that it's better for a person to throw himself in a fiery furnace than to embarrass his fellow publicly. So the word berabim appears in that statement. And in that situation, we have no indication that it was any more public than just Mar Ukva and his wife being present. V'im kein mashma da'af im ika chutz mehamal bin od echad bilvad mikri rabim. It seems from that story, therefore, that if I go ahead and I say something that embarrasses you, all I need is one other person present in order for that to be called public. From that story, that's what the context implies. Because the embarrassed party is embarrassed in front of two people, meaning the person who's shaming him plus one other individual. The ulai it is possible to conjecture, he says, that maybe that's not called public, but really the sin of embarrassing someone publicly is so severe, then maybe they were machner on themselves, even though they weren't considered a constituted public entity. Gam misiif habash akasaf harav da afilu hamochiach es hachote tzarach lahochicho beino levein atzmo velo berabim adkan. And we're going to see the next sif, where there's a halacha of hochacha or tochacha, which is that there's the Torah says there's a positive commandment to rebuke someone if you see them doing something wrong. But that mitzvah cannot be done publicly. It can only be done between you and the person whom you are rebuking. Nami mashma ktsas d'im yesh chutz mimenu od echad nichnas b'geder. It seems there also that even the presence of just one other individual would fall into the category of public. D'im lo kein havile lomar velo bifnei acher u'midanakat rabim miyad acher mashma beino levein atzma. So the fact that the halacha states that you should rebuke him privately and don't rebuke him publicly implies that even if there's only one other person, that means publicly. Mashma ktsas kanal dim yesh od acher lefanav mikri rabim. He says that's the implication. V'yesh lidchos bekal, but that's not a compelling argument because we could look at it another way. We could read it differently. Vitzarich ian, and therefore he feels that it needs more analysis. I tend to agree with his initial reaction, which is that public means anyone other than even the addition of one other person is public, because it could quite often occur that that one person that is present when the fellow is being embarrassed is someone who is very important to that person. I mean, obviously, it's going to depend on the nature of the relationship between the embarrassed party and that other person. Let's say a person is embarrassed, and the other party who hears the embarrassing statement is his mother-in-law, right? Or is someone who he greatly respects and would hate to have his honor being lowered in their eyes because of a certain status that he holds in their heart. So it all depends upon I guess the individuals who are looking on, but certainly even just one person would create additional feelings of humiliation for that individual. Okay.
Rabbi, couldn't you argue that there are instances where, for example, let's say with child rearing, where you want to make an example of one of your kids, they do something, you want the other children to learn, so you embarrass them publicly?
You could, but if you remember from yesterday, we saw that explicitly that the halacha of onas devarim applies to children as well. And so we'll have to see when we get to the next sif about rebuke, which is what you're referring to with children, whether it can ever be justified to rebuke someone in front of others if they need to hear the rebuke as well. So hold on to that thought, Alan, and let's see if we see that in the next sif.
One other thing, if you don't mind,
Sure.
and this is from the sports world, is that often you'll have a situation where, let's say you have the star player, and then you have the rest of the players, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, like I know of this for a fact, that the coach will, on purpose, when the star player messes up, publicly humiliate him in order to show not only him, but the rest of the players that kind of you're all the same, that I'm not showing favoritism. And at least from, those situations that I'm aware of, it's quite beneficial to everybody, even though the player understands that he's being humiliated, for this purpose, like to be a team player. So I'm just wondering if there, and again, you might get to this later, if there are instances where it's complete, it's a benefit.
You're reminding me of a responsum that is brought at the back end of the Sefer Chafetz Chaim, where insults are recorded in the Gemara, where one rabbi insulted a student of his, and it's recorded for all posterity in the Gemara. Rebbe once said to his student Levi, "Kimeduma li she'en lo moach bekod kado." It seems to me that you have no brain in your head. And so let me just bring up that. Let's see here. Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay, I'm going to switch the share now. Hold on a second. I'm going to share you a screen. The Chafetz Chaim at the end of his Sefer, Sefer Chafetz Chaim, brings a tshuva from the Chavos Yair and cites it many times in the Sefer. The Chavos Yair was written by Rav Yair Bachrach, who lives in the 17th century. Just in case you're curious, one of his descendants was Bert Bachrach. Just a little tidbit of interesting Jewish information. The Simon, not that I think he would get nachas from Bert, but because he did not marry in the faith, but he was a wonderful songwriter. So this is from Tshuvas Chavos Yair in responsum 152, and the she'ela is as follows: Nishalti, achar, does everyone see it? Achar de divrei chachamim benachas nishmoim. That I was asked the following question: the words of the sages are supposed to be spoken softly in order for them to be readily heard and accepted. V'nemar b'mishnah, yehi kavod chavercha chaviv alecha kishalach. And the Mishnah says that the honor of your friend should be as beloved to you as your own honor. And if so, Eich matzinu lefa'amim kintorim v'zilzulim b'shas. How then do we find provocations and insults contained in the Gemara? Ke'inyan kadnayim v'shachiv rav omer la lahashmaita. Like, for example, there's one place in the Gemara where Rav is quoted as making a statement, and the person who hears the statement quoted by Rav says that it would seem to me that when Rav said that, he must have been dozing off, because no one in their right mind would say such a thing. Hanemar b'kamaduchti v'chahina rabim, and there are many examples of this. So the Chavos Yoyer answers the question, and he writes as follows. He writes, Tshuva, Yafeh sha'alta, ki vadai afal pi shenikru talmidei chachamim shebebavel chovlim, b'maseches Bava Basra. He says the fact of the matter is that the rabbis in Bavel, and this is something that's important for us to know, that we are a product of our parent culture. And the Gemara in a number of places says that there was a difference in culture between the Babylonian sages and the Palestinian sages, the sages in Eretz Yisrael. The reason why the Babylonian sages were able to have deeper disputations was because Babylonian culture was far more contentious in the way that people communicated with each other than in the culture of Eretz Yisrael. And even though normally that's not something nice, right? You know, like they say, Canadians are very polite, right? But so that's a wonderful thing. But the downside is that if you deal with a polite culture, what if you're going to the Beis Medrash and everyone's so polite that they don't want to question or challenge the other person, right? So fortunately, despite our Canadian politeness, all you have to do is go to Parliament in Ottawa and see every Canadian blow off steam and have an outlet for their contentiousness.
We'll call them the honorable member, but they may not be that honorable when they speak out.
The honorable what?
The honorable member.
Member, right. They lose their honor, right? And or maybe in the hockey rink, that's another outlet for aggression. But in any event, so Bavel is a more aggressive society culturally, and by the way, it's been suggested that that's the reason why, even though there are two Talmuds, there's the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud, we use Talmud Bavli because of the fact that the Babylonian sages were more aggressive and contentious culturally, and therefore there's a greater chance that they were able to arrive at truth in their debates and their disputations. But he says, Lo mitzad harikudim v'hatzeakot gedalot umarot v'hakot kaf al kaf kilu nilchamim ze mul zeh. But even though we call the Babylonian sages damagers, chovlim, like aggressive people, it doesn't mean that they would gesticulate wildly and yell at each other, right? Or make loud noises with their hands and slap their hands and their feet, like as if they were fighting. Like, in other words, you wouldn't see a Babylonian sage in the Beis Medrash have a temper tantrum. Omitzad hakin turim v'zilzulim, and they certainly wouldn't make a habit of saying provocative and insulting things to each other. Chalila, ki lo al signon ze nemar, ki yadabru es oivim bashar. He says that's not what our sages mean when they say that they spoke like enemies at the gates. Sha'avu v'no rava talmido nasu oivim, that many times in a disputation over Torah, a father and a son or a rebbe and a talmud could become great enemies because of a debate that they're having. Rak mitzad shehem misnagdim bisvarosehem uvarayosehem. But rather, the aggressiveness would manifest in the fact that each side in a disputation in Bavel, there was a certain cultural attitude that if you believe in something, dig in your heels and don't concede an inch. That was the Babylonian culture. but not that it was ever reduced to insults and, just ad hominem attacks like we have in society today, unfortunately. Umasha Amar Rav Sheshes, more south of the border. Umasha Amar Rav Sheshes al Rav Kadnayim v'Shachiv Amar Rav lahashmaitza. So but yet we have a statement that Rav Sheshes is very insulting to something that Rav said. He hears Rav quoted, and he says Rav must have been dozing off when he said that. Kimavur b'maseches Yevamos Chavdalad Ambeis Ha'emes Ya'aseh Darko Ki Ma'amar Zeh Einu L'Ginai Rak Sheva Gadol U'Muflag. So Rav Sheshes said that not because he meant to insult Rav, but rather was trying to argue that someone of Rav's great stature could not have made that statement had he been thinking clearly. Shelafi ma'alasu madrigaso shel Rav, I efshar lomar alav sheta b'ta'us kazu, im lo sha'amru kadnaim v'shachib. What he meant to say is, Rav never made mistakes. He was a brilliant analyst. And therefore, the only way he could have made a statement like that, which is patently incorrect, was what Rav Sheshes was saying, was only if Rav had a bad day that day or he was dozing off. Because no one, a great mind like Rav would never have said that. V'lo amar kat shachiv v'nayim k'moshe kasvu atos perak afal pi sheyesh trei gavnei tenuma echad b'tchilas hashena ve'echad b'sofa. And he didn't say kad shachiv v'nayim. He said kad nayim v'shachiv, because there are two stages of sleep as recorded by Tosfos. V'hinei zesha b'sofa afal pi sheyitra b'ma'amaro me'achar shemisor v'holech margish achar kach b'ta'usa v'choser bo. What he meant to say was, the word nayim means that he's starting to doze off, and shachiv means he fell into a deep slumber. And what he meant to say is, Rav was it wasn't that Rav was half asleep. He probably mumbled something as he was falling into a deeper slumber, and that's why he didn't have a chance to even correct himself, because he was totally out. Right after he said it. And that's what Rav Sheshes was implying, is that, Rav couldn't have, either Rav never said it the way you're quoting it, or if he did say it, he must have been dozing off, because no one, Rav in his right mind was so brilliant, he never could have said something so erroneous. Okay. So that was not an insult. He meant it really just as a defense of Rav. And what about Umasha Amar Rebbe Levi b'Yevamos? What about what Rebbe said to Levi in Tractate Yevamos? Kimeduma ani she'en lo moach b'kadkado. He said, it seems to me like you have no brain in your head, is what he said to Levi. When Levi suggested an argument that Rebbe felt was totally without merit. Hainu, shemuter l'Rav lahochiach l'talmidav b'dvarim kashim kidei l'zarzam sheya'ainu v'yashgichu v'yishmeru min hatos v'hashgia. So, what we learn from that statement is that it is permitted for a Rebbe to rebuke his students using harsh language in order to provoke them to do better. So that's why, Alan, you reminded me with a sports analogy of that sometimes it's even permitted for a Rebbe to use provocative language by basically saying, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? What happened to your brain, right? In other words, because essentially what you're saying to that student is, I expect more from you. V'levi hayatalmid l'Rebbe k'begemara sof perakama d'Sanhedrin l'meidin l'fnei chacham Levi m'Rebbe. Levi was one of Rebbe's premier students, and Rebbe therefore said it to him out of love to provoke him. Ulanias daiti nira shemidivrei Rebbe elu yatsa laharamba mashakasav shechayav harav lichos im al talmidav imroa shemitrashlim. It would seem to me that it is on this basis that the Rambam writes that a teacher, a Rebbe, has to occasionally express anger to his students if he sees them slacking off. And this is Huva b'Shulchan Aruch Yoredeyasim and Reishim Vav Sif Yud Aleph. This is brought in the Shulchan Aruch in Yoredeya when it comes to the laws of Talmud Torah. Lachein mipnei sheRebbe yada b'Levi she'adam gadol u'muflag hu. And therefore, in the case of Rebbe, he knew that Levi was a great scholar and had a brilliant mind. V'lo hayaroi sheyita imlo mimiut ion v'hashkach. And he would never have made such an error unless Levi was slacking off. Levi, how could you say such a thing? Like, what have you been have you been distracted lately? Like, have you been watching too many Netflix things in between sheer, right? Like, where's your head? How could you say such a thing? Lochein diber alav kashos, chalila lo mikas omigovarucho. And when Rebbe spoke to him, it was, God forbid, it was not out of genuine anger. It was not out of arrogance. The Hare Tanya Sopsota, Mishames Rebbe Batlanava. And we know that Rebbe was so humble because, as the Talmud itself records in Tractate Sota, that when Rebbe died, humility died with him, because there was no one as humble as Rebbe. Rebbe is the nickname for Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi. That was his appellation. There are other times when language such as this is mentioned jokingly. Kemoshe Kasav Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Chia bar Abba b'Bavavasra b'Bechoros ad da'achlis kafnisa b'Bavel. He says, by the time we get to sit down and eat, there's going to be a famine in Bavel. B'sham pirashatos sherot salomar. 1 second. Oh, I'm sorry. No, ad da'achlis kafnisa means that this will happen when you start eating bad dates in Bavel. Venirali al derech mashapirish harav sof per kama orla al kofnio she'odem smadar v'hachi kamerle ki Bavel ha'amuka mikol haratzos vaday sham hatmarim tovim ma'od ki b'mishna per kama debikurim. Okay, so there, in that particular Gemara, Reb Chia bar Abba made a statement that would be the parallel in the English language would be like, when hell freezes over. Okay, you've heard that phrase before. So Reb Chia bar Abba said that such and such will happen when you eat bad dates in Bavel. And what he was saying to him was that everyone knows that the dates of Bavel are of premium quality. Iraqi dates are the best dates because you have this fertile crescent in that part of the Middle East, because it's a valley, and so it's very, very hot, and the dates that grow there become very sweet. Rak shilroi lahamtin ad gemar bishulam v'hamamaher la'achlam lifnei zeh vaday gruen. He says, but you have to wait until they ripen, and if you eat them before they ripen, then they're going to be bad quality. Hachanami lo yarada to l'sof hamishna b'lachein b'shnei hamakomos amalei targemina b'seifa. So therefore, in that case over there, what he was saying to him was not until hell freezes over, but really more like your interpretation was like eating bad dates in Bavel, because you were too hasty in trying to interpret it. Just like a person who eats bad dates in Bavel, you only eat bad dates in Bavel because you ate them before they were ripe. So he was telling him in a joking way. Begitin mishum de ami shapir na'ehu v'chulei. We'd have to go back and look in these instances. Just take a look. He goes through a bunch of different instances of where the words seem like insults, but they turn out to be not insults. And that's really the whole theme of this responsum. He goes through a number of different instances in the Talmud where the words are seemingly insulting, when in reality they're either said out of politeness to a person who should have known better, or to encourage a person to work harder in their studies. Okay, so there's more. I mean, the tshuva goes on, but I just wanted you to see that that's but there is an interesting halacha that we've just seen, which is that sometimes it is permitted for a rebbe to express anger at a student. The question is he allowed to do so publicly? That we haven't yet seen, and maybe we'll take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in your Ideya that the Chavos Yair quoted, and maybe we'll take a look and when we go on to the next halacha. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today. Let's stop the share. Any questions, comments?
I presume the rabbi also has to know how the student is going to respond, because there's different sensitivities.
Obviously, right. Obviously, if a student is very fragile, then one would have to be much more careful in insulting the student. Yeah. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care, gentlemen.
Thank you.